thousands of holidaymakers travel to different destinations for the Christmas break. The Border Management Authority has vowed to intensify operations at the country's borders. This is all to ensure smooth movement of people and goods. The authority says it will also deploy more officials at the Lebombo border separating South Africa and Zimbabwe. For more on this, I'm joined in studio by Dr. Michael Masiapato. Very good morning to you, Dr. Masiapato. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you very much, Mpo, and thanks for the invite.
You'll be at the Lebombo border for your first leg of deployment to intensify operations. How are you planning on facilitating movement for this peak period, as we are right in the middle of it, and it's bound to get even more busy at the points?
Yeah, no, indeed. From this Friday, I myself will actually be deployed on the ground at the Lebombo border post. That is the post to Mozambique on the N4 corridor. That is in terms of the exit phase of our execution of our plan. And then in terms of the return, I will be deployed at Lebombo border post from the 2nd of January, mainly for the return. But in terms of the execution of our plan, we have really put a lot of measures in place to make sure that our operation goes as smoothly as possible. We have deployed additional 380 people across our various ports of entry to make sure that we are able to capacitate our officials. We have also deployed the ICT colleagues on the ground to make sure that they are on standby in case there might be any challenges relating to our systems, so that they will be able to make sure that they actually up and running as smoothly as possible. So there are a lot of things that we have done, working together with the rest of the colleagues in the border environment, as it were.
In terms of capacitating logistics, I mean, you've spoken about the boots on the ground, but what about the aspect on times, especially because some of the busiest ports already operate 24 hours? Are there any adjustments on that front?
Yeah, for those ports that are already operating on a 24-hour basis, they're fine. Yeah. And mainly our big ports are already operating on a 24-hour basis. So for those ones, in terms of time, 24-hour is the maximum that is available. And on that basis, we are still to continue operating on those 24-hour basis. But there are other ports which are also very much critical, basically below the top 10, which mainly operate on a 24-hour basis, where we have requested the Minister of Home Affairs to allow us to extend operation hours in those various ports. And most of those ports, they had been closing around 10. We have then extended by 2 hours, then they will be closing at around midnight. So we have done that to make sure that we are able to handle the volumes as people are exiting the country for the neighboring countries for the purposes of the festive season. But of course, even those that are actually exiting through the airports.
You talk about volumes. How many people are you expecting to move through South Africa's borders during this festive season?
So basically, as we have indicated even in our statement, the 3 years before COVID, we've been averaging around 6.2, 6.3, 6.2 million, as it were. And of course, during the year of COVID, which is 2020, we then dipped to around 1.4. And then during the next year, which is 2021, we then dipped, we started to recover to around 1.4. And then from there, last year, we then had 4 million that we actually facilitated during the festive season. We are therefore hoping that in this current period, we are then to go back to the pre-COVID numbers, which is around 6 million people, as it were.
Before the Border Management Authority Act was established, coordination between the various government departments wasn't always smooth sailing. I mean, a lot of criticism, for instance, when it comes to the culture of abuse and corruption within the Home Affairs Department, for instance. And as you take stock of that, what are you up against? And how are you putting measures in place to mitigate against things like that, which is very likely?
Yeah, you see, one thing that we can accept is that indeed the issue of corruption had always been very much problematic, and in the country at large. But in terms of the ports, we do accept that that has also been a challenge. But we have put a lot of measures in place. Remember, once you do integration, which is what we have done, wherein we then bring all of the various officials under a single command and control, with each port having a single commander, that on its own started to at least bring some kind of synergy in the environment. But the most important thing that we have done for the purposes of addressing the issues of corruption, which is fairly bribery, in fact, is the intensification of our, what we call access control into the port. So what has been the challenge previously is that people will literally enter the port environment without necessarily requisite documents. So once they enter the port environment, then they will go to officials, and that is where then they start with all these scrupulous interactions and end up with a situation where people end up paying and at the end up exiting the country illegally. So what we have now done is we have intensified our access point into the port. So if you are to look at Bait Bridge as an example, on our north gate, that is the gate that you exit into Zim and is the gate you enter into South Africa. And the south gate is the one where you enter into South Africa, as it were. So what we have done, we have intensified deployment of the border guards in those access points to make sure that only the people who access the port itself are people with requisite documents already. So that on its own is going to then assist us to make sure that only the people who appear before the immigration officers, for instance, are already people with requisite documents. And to that extent, there will not be a need for anyone to bribe anyone, because in any event, the people inside will be the people that qualify. For those that do not qualify, we do return on the spot and make sure that they don't enter into the processing area.
Should you find that there are flaws in this system, what sort of accountability is there? I mean, how many jobs could be on the line? Are people going to get fired, in efforts to really tighten management at the borders?
We had already indicated, even in our statement, that up to this point, as part of the cleaning exercise, we had actually released around 4 individuals since we started in April. And on that basis, we can also confirm that there are around 8 officials that are currently undergoing the processes for them to be exited out of the system on the basis of the same kind of issues where people do things that they are not supposed to be doing. But I think one thing that is very much important is at least the Border Management Authority Act Section 13 empowers us to do vetting of all of the officials in the border management environment. And that on its own will then allow us to do continuous lifestyle audits as we go into the future. So that then becomes very much critical, because it will then enable us to be able to identify individuals who seems to be living beyond their means and be able to do further action to be able to get them out of the system. So those are some of the things that actually we have put on the table. But in the long term, we are also working on getting what we call body cams. Most of the jurisdictions in other parts of the world are actually using body cams, through which every interaction of the officials with any traveler is already on camera. And that camera becomes control of by not the person, but is controlled from a central place. And it can only be switched off if somebody, for example, goes to the bathroom and all of that. But the key point is, that is our plan, to make sure that we are able to monitor the activities of our officials as they interact with the travelers.
When are you hoping to implement that plan?
So that is purely the issue of procurement. So as we speak now, we are in that particular process of the procurement, and we are hoping that in the new year, probably around April, we should be able to have that already up and running as the Border Management Authority. So
as a newly formed unit, I mean, you have achieved some successes. What we heard and what stands out is your ability to stop and search about 42 buses. And with that, of course, you found about 443 children under the age of 8. And that story in itself, I mean, there were so many versions of why and how these children attempted to get through the borders. What's the latest as you follow up and track and try and get to the bottom of what exactly was happening there?
Yeah, no, I think you're right to say that is one thing that it ended up having with a lot of versions and all of that. But I think the main point that is a fact is we actually had that encounter. And that was not necessarily the first encounter. It's just that it is an encounter that was at the highest level in terms of numbers, and that is why we had to make sure that it is actually communicated. But that is what we do all the time. We do find unaccompanied children without documentation attempting to enter the Republic illegally, whether from Zimbabwe, or from Mozambique, or from Lesotho, or any of our neighbors. In those instances, we make sure that we don't accept those people to enter into the Republic. So in this instance, what we have done, which is very much critical, is, and that is where the confusion arose. What we did, when we actually realized that situation, we did not allow those people to enter into our processing area. As I've said, we intensified our access control, so we denied them entry. So denied them entry means that we then return them, meaning that they have to go back into their country. And on that basis, we were very much pleased when the Minister of Social Development from on the Zimbabwean side did indicate that they did receive the children and they were in the process of integrating back those children with their families, and also the issue of saying that as they do that work, they are busy investigating with the Zimbabwe Republican Police to be able to find the people who had been behind that particular exercise. But what we did subsequent to that, I think it was just unfortunate that there were some statements that came back and forth, which was very much problematic. The issue of human trafficking is serious.
Yes.
West of it, the issue of child trafficking is even more serious. So that is why we don't necessarily want these issues to be entering into kind of a political space, because it's a very serious issue operationally that we deal with. So on that basis, I will say that we then had to ultimately have a conversation with our Zimbabwean counterpart. And I think you saw that. They basically brought a delegation of 19, which included colleagues who work on social development. Even on our side, we had colleagues from the Department of Social Development, led by their DG, Linton Kuhn, who was part of the delegation. The intention was to make sure that we compare notes, but the most important thing, we are able to look at the requirements for the unaccompanied minors, on what are the requirements for them to be able to enter the Republic and also exit the country. We did that to make sure that there is no any confusion in as far as that part is concerned. So as we speak now, work is underway by the social developments to be able to reconcile the children back to their families, and on that basis, from the Border Management Authority point of view, we continue to implement the law as provided in the regulation.
In comparing notes with Zimbabwean authorities, what were you able to establish when it comes to requirements and the sort of scrutiny that comes with unaccompanied minors?
You see, I think one thing that we can accept, which is very much serious, is that we have been a bit lax in terms of border management. In as much as the requirements had always been there, but they had not necessarily been followed. So when we came through as the Border Management Authority, we have to now start doing things differently. And that is why there was that bit of shock on the environment. But if you were to go and check at the Home Affairs website, for example, from 2015, the requirements had always been there. Because remember, as the BMA, we do not make laws. We do not make regulations regarding the work that we do. We just make regulations in terms of the Border Management Authority Act. But overall, on immigration, they are still made by the Department of Home Affairs. So on that basis, we have to then implement. So what we then did was to make sure that they have a full understanding of the requirements. And it's not only them, by the way. I mean, we engage with the colleagues from Mozambique, we engage with the colleagues from Lesotho, and all of our neighboring countries. This thing also applies even when colleagues had to fly out of the Republic or even come through. With the flying, the reason why it is a bit easier there is because the airlines themselves do have an unaccompanied minor program where a parent will even pay extra money for that particular child to be taken care of on a special basis in terms of flying. So all airlines do know the protocols, and that is why we don't have much challenges that side. The problem is in terms of land, because the buses and the taxis continue to ignore what are supposed to be the requirements. So in this instance, we made sure that people do understand, and on that basis, we are expecting that this kind of incidents are not supposed to repeat themselves, especially at that level or at that magnitude.
Yeah, absolutely. You speak about the delays. You speak about buses and taxis and trucks. The delays in the movement of goods. Where are we standing as you and I speak? Because this has been a very frustrating incident that has affected even the country's economy.
Yeah, maybe what we can say on that point, firstly, is to say, if you go to N1 corridor into Beitbridge, you will realize that we've been able to get that one addressed as we speak. Now, we do know that at least there has also been a bit of a shift of the trucks out of Lebombo into Grobler's Bridge, which then enters into Botswana and then goes up into Kazangula Bridge and enter into Zambia. So that also had contributed in splitting the volumes. So on that basis, we don't have issues. If you go to our other big ports like Maseru Bridge, Fixbeck and all of that, we have no issues. The only place we have an issue is Lebombo. And that is the reason why I will actually be going to Lebombo myself, is because that side, it is very much complicated. The complexity in this instance is on the basis of the infrastructure and the layout of the port. And I think you will fairly be aware that the Minister of Home Affairs had already given out a request for proposal for the private sector to come and help us to redesign these ports, open them up and make sure that we have a lane for the trucks, lane for the buses, lane for the small vehicles and all of that. But that is for the long term. In the current, what we have done is we have actually co-located our officials, BMA immigration team, together with the colleagues from SARS into one spot for the purposes of the movement of trade, so that the drivers don't have to park a truck, get out and try to go to offices to be administrated. So we use kind of a toll gate approach, where they come in and they give their documents for customs, but we also process their passports for them to be able to go through. So those are some of the interventions that we've made. But unfortunately, because of the volumes, especially on the N4 corridor to Lebombo, we continue to have those volumes. And based on the challenges on the other side, for example, in Richards Bay, as well as some challenges in Durban, most of the freight forwarders, they are shifting into Maputo port, as it were. So that creates that volume. A typical example, we moved from dealing with 800 trucks per day to around 1,300 trucks per day. Now we are sitting at between 1,900 to 2,000 trucks per day. So you can see the volume. So in as much as we do the best to facilitate, the volumes keep on rising. And that is why the queue will fairly be there. But we do our best to facilitate them as they go to the other side.
Dr. Masiapato, let me thank you for your time and coming in studio to talk to us. The Commissioner and Chief Executive Officer of the Border Management Authority in studio, talking to us there about the intensification of operations at the Lebombo border post, of course, as we get into the festive season.